If you think you can run from fate, think again. The rain hit the streets of Chicago in relentless sheets, turning the neon signs into blurry halos and making the pavement glisten like shards of glass. Emily Carter's hands trembled on the steering wheel of her beat-up sedan as she navigated through puddles that splashed up against the undercarriage, soaking her shoes. The GPS in her phone insisted she was on the right route, but her instincts screamed otherwise. At 24, juggling 3 jobs and nursing school, she had learned to trust herself in impossible situations. Yet the sudden panic in her chest told her this wasn't ordinary. The Uber app had glitched, or maybe she had tapped the wrong ride. Either way, she now sat in a black SUV that smelled faintly of leather and something sharper, something calculated. The driver didn't speak, his profile dark and angular, his eyes hidden behind reflective sunglasses despite the storm outside. Emily tried to steady her breath, pretending to scroll through her phone, but every muscle in her body was alert, every nerve humming with tension. Then he spoke, his voice smooth, measured, carrying a weight that seemed to push against the walls of the car. "You're not where you're supposed to be," he said, and it wasn't a question. Emily swallowed hard, nodding without looking at him, her mind racing to calculate an escape route, any excuse to exit this vehicle before it drove her further into unknown danger. The SUV's engine purred like a predator, steady and inevitable, as it carried her through deserted streets lit by flickering streetlights. Emily's heartbeat rattled in her chest, each thump a reminder that her choice, or mistake, had thrown her into someone else's world, a world built on rules she didn't understand and power she could barely imagine. She tried to form words, a polite excuse, a plea, but the driver's eyes met hers in the rearview mirror, cold and unwavering, as if he could read the fear written in every line of her face. And then, as the vehicle turned onto a quieter avenue, he finally removed his sunglasses, revealing eyes so piercing and blue they seemed to cut through the dimness, measuring her, analyzing every reaction, every twitch of muscle. The realization hit her like ice. She wasn't just a passenger in a stranger's car. She was inside the orbit of Chicago's most dangerous empire, a world where choices were few and consequences enormous. Emily's hands clenched in her lap as she fought the urge to panic, to scream, to bolt for the door that might not open on command. Yet somewhere beneath the adrenaline, a strange thread of curiosity wove through the fear, a dangerous fascination with the calm control exuded by the man who had claimed the night as his own domain. And in that quiet, tension-filled pause, as the rain pounded and tires splashed through puddles, Emily realized that one wrong ride had changed everything, and there was no turning back. The black SUV turned sharply onto an alley lined with glistening cobblestones and the neon reflections of closed shops. Emily's eyes darted to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see another car following. Yet the street behind them was empty, the city asleep or indifferent to her predicament. Jackson Drake did not speak, but the slight tilt of his head, the subtle tightening of his jaw, conveyed a command that did not need words. Emily's palms were damp against her knees, and she reminded herself to breathe, slow and steady, as she attempted to anchor herself in the here and now. The interior of the SUV smelled faintly of leather and cedar, a sharp contrast to the chill of the rain-soaked streets outside. She could feel the vibration of the tires against the wet pavement beneath her, a rhythmic reminder of the movement that carried her further into uncertainty. Jackson finally spoke, his voice low but carrying an authority that seemed to reverberate through the small cabin. "You cannot go back," he said, his eyes meeting hers in the mirror, sharp and calculating. Emily swallowed hard, a shiver running down her spine, and nodded without fully understanding. Her mind raced to analyze every possibility, every route to safety, yet an odd sense of inevitability settled over her. The SUV slowed as it approached a nondescript building with tall black gates, the kind of architecture that hinted at wealth hidden behind austerity. As Jackson parked, he turned toward her with a measured calm, his piercing blue eyes assessing her with a depth that made her stomach knot. "Step out," he instructed simply, and the weight of the command left no room for hesitation. Emily opened the door cautiously, the rain soaking her coat instantly as the cold air hit her. She stepped onto the slick pavement, every nerve alive to the environment around her. Yet she felt an inexplicable sense of being observed, catalogued, judged by someone who could anticipate every move. Jackson's presence was a constant, a silent tether she could neither ignore nor confront directly. He moved around the front of the vehicle and gestured toward the gates, his posture impeccable, composed, radiating control. As they entered the courtyard, Emily's attention was drawn to the stark contrast between the wet, chaotic city streets and the manicured order inside the compound. The hedges were trimmed precisely, the stone pathways laid with geometric perfection, and the light from the building windows cast an amber glow that softened the edges of the night. Jackson walked beside her without touching, yet his aura filled the space, an unspoken reminder that he dictated the terms here. Emily's heart pounded, both from the exertion and the anticipation of the unknown. As they moved further into the compound, where shadows and warm light played across the walls in a cinematic rhythm, every sound was amplified: the click of her shoes on stone, the distant hum of the city beyond the gates, the faint whisper of wine through the trees, and she realized that the ordinary world she had known was now separated by these walls, the rules rewritten in this territory. Jackson stopped at a set of large double doors, turning his gaze to her once more. His expression was unreadable, a mixture of calculation and curiosity, and for a brief moment, Emily wondered if he could see her thoughts as clearly as he saw her movements. He opened the doors, revealing an interior that was as orderly as the exterior. Polished wood floors, soft lighting, and the faint scent of fine coffee and cedar mingling in the air. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her with a definitive click that made her stomach flutter with tension. The atmosphere was calm yet charged, every detail meticulously curated to reflect control and power. Jackson motioned for her to follow, and as she did, Emily realized that her misstep, the wrong ride, had transported her into a world that was equal parts intimidating and fascinating, where every movement, every glance mattered, and where the night had only just begun. Emily followed Jackson through the polished corridor, her steps tentative on the glossy wood floors, each sound echoing softly against the high ceilings. The air inside the building carried a mixture of warmth and subtle fragrance, a hint of cedar and brewing coffee that made the environment feel almost domestic despite the unmistakable order and control it exuded. Her heart was still racing, a combination of adrenaline and the persistent awareness that she was no longer in the world she had known moments ago. Jackson walked with deliberate precision, his presence commanding the space without a word, his eyes occasionally flicking toward her in a measured assessment. The lighting shifted as they passed into a library-like room, the walls lined with books and artifacts meticulously arranged, a reflection of discipline and taste that suggested a mind accustomed to authority and structure. Emily's gaze traveled over the spines of books, noting titles ranging from law to architecture, and she realized that knowledge and preparation were as integral to this world as power and influence. Jackson stopped at a set of high-backed chairs by a window that overlooked the rain-slicked courtyard, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated briefly, feeling the weight of his scrutiny, before lowering herself into the chair, her fingers brushing the armrest as if to anchor herself. Jackson remained standing, the dim light casting shadows across his features, emphasizing the sharp line of his jaw and the piercing clarity of his blue eyes. He spoke finally, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority that made it impossible to ignore. "Emily, I need to understand you," he said, leaning slightly against the window frame, the faint reflection of rain tracing across the glass behind him. She blinked, startled by the directness, and struggled to find words, her mind still processing the rapid succession of events that had brought her here. Jackson's gaze did not waver, and in that steadiness, Emily felt an unspoken expectation to be honest, to reveal some part of herself that she had guarded even in her own thoughts. She took a deep breath, noting the rhythmic tapping of rain against the window and the muted hum of the city beyond, and she began to speak about her life, her studies, her multiple jobs, the small apartment she shared with a roommate, and the determination that had carried her through exhaustion and uncertainty. Jackson listened without interruption, his expression unreadable, yet she could sense the calculation behind his attention, the evaluation of not just her words but the subtle cues in her posture, her breathing, the way her hands fidgeted in her lap. When she finished, he finally moved, seating himself opposite her, his presence shifting the atmosphere from one of distant authority to engaged interest. "You have courage," he observed, his voice softer now, but no less measured, "to navigate your world with such resolve." Emily felt a flicker of validation mixed with lingering unease, unsure whether to trust the sincerity behind his words or to brace for a command hidden beneath the compliment. The room seemed to shrink around them, the outside storm muted by the thick walls, leaving only the two of them, a balance of tension and cautious curiosity. As Jackson stood and moved to a side table to pour a glass of water, Emily noticed a small detail, a notebook left open on a nearby desk, filled with precise notes and diagrams, suggesting a life organized with intention and care. Her own chaotic routine felt starkly juxtaposed against this meticulous world, and she realized that every step she had taken that night had brought her into a place that demanded adaptation, observation, and a recognition that power could exist quietly as much as overtly. Jackson returned, offering her the glass, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment, a connection both simple and charged with unspoken acknowledgement. Emily accepted the water, her hands steadying despite the flutter in her chest, and as she sipped, she realized that the night was far from over. Every sound, every shadow, every glance would carry significance, and her choices moving forward would shape her presence in this carefully controlled world. The rain continued to fall outside, the city lights refracting against the wet surfaces, painting the courtyard in streaks of color and reflection, and Emily felt the weight of her misstep, the wrong ride, settling into the gravity of the moment, making her acutely aware that nothing about this night would be ordinary or easily forgotten. Jackson led Emily through a narrow hallway that opened into a grand sitting room, its high ceilings adorned with intricate moldings and soft recessed lighting that cast a warm glow across the polished floors. The rain outside continued its steady rhythm, pattering against the tall windows, and the occasional flash of lightning illuminated the room briefly, highlighting the precise arrangement of furniture and decor. Emily's eyes darted from the delicate vases on the shelves to the artful placement of books and artifacts, each item seeming to tell a story of meticulous order and cultivated taste. She felt the weight of her misstep, realizing that she had stepped into a world where attention to detail and control were paramount, a place where one wrong move could have far-reaching consequences. Jackson remained near the window, his posture relaxed yet commanding, as he watched her take in her surroundings, the sharp line of his jaw and the piercing clarity of his blue eyes reflecting both authority and a subtle curiosity. "This is my world," he said, his tone measured, each word deliberate, carrying the quiet weight of someone accustomed to having their environment and the people within it conform to an unspoken standard. Emily swallowed hard, nodding, her throat dry, and she tried to form words, to explain her presence, yet found herself silenced by the gravity of his gaze. The room felt both intimate and vast, every shadow and reflection amplified by the low light, and she could not help but notice the subtle hum of ambient sound, the distant rumble of the city, the gentle click of the rain against the windows, the faint rustle of fabric as Jackson shifted slightly. She moved toward a small seating area, her movements careful, deliberate, each step measured as if to avoid disrupting the precise balance of the room. Jackson followed, settling into a chair across from her with an ease that contrasted with the tension that Emily felt coiling in her chest. He gestured to the sofa, inviting her to sit, and she complied, her hands resting lightly on her knees, aware of every nuance of his presence. "You are more observant than most," he remarked, his voice softer now, less commanding, and Emily felt a flicker of acknowledgement pass between them, a recognition of her capacity to notice and understand her surroundings despite the disorientation and fear she had experienced. She breathed slowly, attempting to steady the rapid pulse in her chest, and began to speak quietly about herself, the careful words emerging in a measured cadence, describing her life, her studies, the long hours she had endured, the small apartment she shared, and the determination that had carried her through countless moments of exhaustion. Jackson listened intently, his expression unreadable, yet Emily sensed the evaluation in his gaze, the weighing of character, resilience, and adaptability. The soft hum of the room seemed to underscore the gravity of their interaction. Each word, each pause imbued with significance, and she realized that this encounter, born from a misstep, had placed her in a space where observation, presence, and understanding were as crucial as action. Jackson reached for a glass of water from a side table, offering it to her with a brief, silent gesture, and as Emily accepted, their fingers brushed lightly, a fleeting contact that carried an unspoken acknowledgement, a subtle connection amid the tension and formality. She sipped, feeling the cool liquid anchor her slightly, and she understood that the night was far from over, that each step she took, each glance exchanged, and each choice would ripple through the dynamics of this controlled world. The storm outside persisted, lightning flashing in rhythm with her heartbeat, and Emily felt the weight of her unintended intrusion settle fully, aware that her presence here had already begun to reshape the contours of the night and the possibilities that lay ahead, in ways she could not yet predict but would need to navigate carefully. The rain had eased outside, leaving the streets glistening under the scattered glow of streetlights, and Emily found herself sitting in the expansive living area of Jackson Drake's compound. Her legs crossed tensely, hands clasped in her lap, aware of every creak of the floorboards beneath her. The warmth inside contrasted sharply with the chill from the storm, and she shivered slightly, more from nerves than temperature. Jackson remained standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows, the amber glow of the interior lights catching the contours of his face, emphasizing the calm authority he carried without effort. His eyes scanned the room, briefly meeting hers, and Emily felt an unexpected tension, an unspoken question hanging between them. What would happen next in this world she had stumbled into? The room was impeccably arranged, each piece of furniture and decoration conveying a sense of order and precision that seemed to demand respect and attention. A soft hum of the air system provided a steady background, almost musical, and Emily's ears tuned into every subtle sound. The gentle click of Jackson shifting his stance, the faint scratch of his shoes against the polished floor, the occasional distant car horn from the city beyond. She took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts, recalling the sequence of events that had brought her here, each misstep converging into this singular, tense moment. Jackson finally spoke, his voice low, measured, carrying a calm authority that made it impossible to ignore. "Tell me about yourself," he said, the simplicity of the request carrying weight far beyond the words. Emily's throat tightened, and she began to speak in a careful, even tone, describing her daily routines, the challenges of juggling work and school, the small apartment she shared, and the moments of quiet determination that had kept her going through exhaustion. Jackson listened intently, his expression unreadable, yet Emily felt the weight of his attention, the subtle assessment in his gaze that seemed to weigh her words and gestures for hidden meaning. The conversation continued, a measured exchange that built a quiet rhythm between them, punctuated only by the occasional glance toward the storm-lit windows. Emily became aware of the contrast between her own chaotic, unstructured life and the controlled, deliberate world around her, each object, each space reflecting a command over circumstance that she had never experienced. Jackson moved toward a side table, pouring a glass of water with precise, fluid movements, and offered it to her with a silent gesture, his eyes never leaving hers. She accepted, feeling the cool weight of the glass in her hands, the simple act grounding her as her mind processed the implications of her presence in this carefully maintained environment. The quiet stretched between them, filled with the subtle music of the storm dissipating outside and the ambient hum of the compound, a pause pregnant with unspoken possibilities. Emily realized that every choice, every movement, and every word would be noticed, and that the balance of power and understanding here was delicate, shifting with the smallest gesture or glance. Jackson finally returned to the chair opposite her, sitting with a measured calm, and in that moment, Emily felt the first flicker of comprehension. She was no longer just a visitor in this space. She was part of a dynamic that required observation, adaptability, and awareness of the unseen currents shaping every interaction. The night stretched on, the amber light softening shadows, and Emily understood that her journey through this world was only beginning, that the storm outside had cleared but the turbulence inside, The questions, the calculations, the tension would continue to shape the hours ahead, and she could not turn back, could not reclaim the ordinary life she had known before one wrong ride had brought her here. Emily sat quietly, the glass of water still resting in her hands as the weight of the evening pressed down with a quiet insistence. Outside, the rain had slowed to a drizzle, the city lights reflecting in the puddles on the pavement below the tall windows. Jackson Drake remained standing, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, a presence that seemed to fill the room without effort. Emily's thoughts raced, tracing the events of the night in rapid succession, trying to make sense of how a simple misstep had brought her into this carefully controlled world. She could feel the tension coiling in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and uncertainty, yet underneath it, a flicker of curiosity, a subtle acknowledgement that she was encountering a life vastly different from her own. Jackson moved toward the window, his gaze distant for a moment, taking in the view of the glistening streets below. Emily observed him, noticing the quiet precision in every movement, the way his eyes seemed to measure the world and the people within it, calculating, analyzing, assessing. She realized that she had entered a place where observation mattered as much as action, where even the smallest gesture could carry significance. He turned his attention back to her, his eyes steady and piercing, yet there was a faint softness, almost imperceptible, in the way he regarded her. "You handled yourself well tonight," he said, his voice calm, carrying both acknowledgement and a subtle test of her composure. Emily felt her heartbeat quicken, unsure whether it was the compliment or the intensity of his gaze that stirred the feeling. She nodded, lowering her eyes briefly, then met his stare, trying to convey both honesty and resilience. Jackson moved to a nearby console and adjusted a small collection of papers, his actions precise and deliberate, a reflection of a life attuned to order and control. Emily's eyes wandered around the room, taking in the meticulous organization, the subtle interplay of light and shadow, the way the furniture and objects seemed chosen with care, each one speaking to an exacting standard and a life built on structure. She felt the contrast sharply, the chaos and unpredictability of her own world juxtaposed against the space where every detail was intentional, controlled, and purposeful. Jackson returned to his position near the window, his attention shifting between the city outside and her presence within the room, and Emily sensed a careful balance, a silent negotiation of trust and observation. She sipped her water, the cool liquid anchoring her momentarily, and allowed herself a small breath, steadying against the flood of impressions and emotions. The room was quiet save for the faint hum of the air system and the occasional distant sound of the city, a calm that felt almost unnatural after the rapid events that had unfolded since she had entered the SUV. Emily reflected on the subtle nuances of their interaction, the measured speech, the careful attention to detail, the unspoken expectations, and she realized that the night had established a new set of rules, one where awareness, responsiveness, and presence would dictate her experience. Jackson's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, a quiet intensity in his eyes that suggested both challenge and acknowledgement, and Emily felt the first stirrings of understanding, a recognition that her presence here was not accidental in the larger sense, that the night's events were shaping a dynamic she had yet to fully grasp. She set the glass down carefully on the table beside her, the sound sharp in the quiet room, and straightened her posture, preparing herself for whatever came next, aware that every step, every glance, and every choice would be significant in the unfolding hours of this night. The amber light softened the edges of the room, and Emily felt the tension settle into a quiet anticipation, knowing that she had crossed an invisible threshold, one that would test her resilience, her adaptability, and her capacity to navigate a world that demanded both observation and courage. Emily's hands rested lightly on her knees as she watched Jackson move across the room with measured precision, each step deliberate, each motion carrying the quiet authority that seemed to govern every corner of the space. The compound beyond the windows glimmered faintly under the lingering drizzle, the amber glow of interior lights contrasting against the muted silver of the wet pavement outside. She felt the tension of anticipation coil in her chest, a mixture of curiosity and unease, knowing that her next moments in this world could shift the balance of their interaction. Jackson paused near a tall bookshelf, his fingers tracing the edges of carefully arranged volumes, and Emily noted the meticulous attention to detail in everything he touched, a reflection of control and discipline that extended far beyond the room. He turned slowly toward her, his eyes steady, blue and piercing, carrying an unspoken question that made her pulse quicken. "Emily," he began, his tone measured, carrying both authority and an unusual softness. "This place is structured, every detail intentional, and it will challenge you in ways you might not anticipate." Emily nodded, swallowing the knot in her throat, and replied in a careful, even voice, explaining how she had navigated the chaotic pressures of her own life, the balance of multiple jobs and studies, and the perseverance that had allowed her to endure exhaustion and uncertainty. Jackson listened, unwavering, absorbing every word, every subtle gesture of her hands and posture, and Emily felt the weight of his attention, the quiet gravity that seemed to follow her like a presence without sound. The faint hum of the air system and the muted rhythm of the city beyond the windows created a backdrop that amplified every movement and every pause, the stillness filled with an energy that demanded awareness. Jackson moved toward a small side table, retrieved a glass of water, and offered it to her, his gesture precise and deliberate, a quiet acknowledgement of the presence she held in this space. Emily accepted the glass, the cool weight grounding her as she allowed herself a brief moment to breathe, to process the magnitude of being inside this meticulously curated environment. She sipped slowly, noting the contrast between the warmth inside and the damp, reflective streets outside, and felt an unfamiliar sense of clarity settling over the anxiety that had accompanied her arrival. Jackson returned to his position near the window, watching her with a steady gaze, and she recognized the careful balance in their interaction. Observation and understanding, measured attention, and the acknowledgement of capability and courage. She adjusted her posture, allowing her hands to rest lightly on the armrests of her chair, and noticed the subtle details of the room. The carefully placed artifacts, the polished surfaces, the interplay of light and shadow, that spoke of a life built on intentionality and discipline. Every sound, every reflection, every gesture in the room carried meaning, and Emily realized that her choices, her awareness, and her responses would shape her experience in the hours to come. The storm had quieted outside, leaving only the occasional distant flash of lightning, and inside, the amber light softened the edges of the space, highlighting the dynamic between them. A dance of control, observation, and emerging understanding. Emily set the glass down gently, feeling the smooth surface beneath her fingertips, and straightened her shoulders, ready to engage fully in the dialogue, the silent negotiation, and the unspoken currents that governed this unexpected encounter. She understood, in the quiet intensity of the moment, that her presence here was no accident, that her observations, choices, and resilience mattered, and that the night's unfolding events would continue to test her adaptability and perception within a world defined by structure, authority, and exacting standards. Emily shifted slightly in her chair, the soft glow of the amber lights casting delicate shadows across her features, highlighting the tension and cautious curiosity that coursed through her as she took in the refined environment around her. The distant hum of the city was a muted reminder of the world outside, a stark contrast to the controlled calm within Jackson Drake's compound. She felt the lingering pulse of adrenaline, a subtle echo of the journey that had brought her here, and with it a realization that her decisions, her observations, and her instincts mattered more than ever. Jackson stood by the tall windows, the city lights reflecting faintly on the glass, his posture relaxed yet deliberate, a presence that seemed to occupy the space without the need for words. Emily's gaze traced the contours of the room. Once more, the polished surfaces, the carefully curated artifacts, and the orderly arrangement of furniture, each element speaking silently of discipline, foresight, and authority. The contrast between her own chaotic routines and the intentional precision of this world pressed on her. Yet she found a strange steadiness in acknowledging it. Jackson finally spoke, his voice calm, low, and measured, each word deliberate, resonating with the subtle weight of command. "Emily, this environment is designed to test awareness, observation, and adaptability. Each choice you make here has significance." Emily's hands tightened slightly in her lap, and she nodded, letting the words settle, recognizing both the challenge and the acknowledgement of her presence. She began to recount, carefully and evenly, the contours of her life, the demands of multiple jobs, the rigorous pursuit of her studies, the small apartment she shared, the daily negotiations with exhaustion and responsibility that had become routine. Jackson listened, unmoving, yet his gaze weighed every gesture, every inflection, every shift in posture, and Emily felt the depth of his assessment, understanding that presence alone was a measure of capability in this world. The faint whisper of the wind against the glass, the subtle hum of the heating system, and the occasional distant car horn from the streets below created a delicate rhythm, a backdrop for the unspoken dialogue between them. Emily sipped the water Jackson had offered earlier, the cool liquid grounding her as she allowed herself a moment of reflection, noting the balance of control and patience that shaped his demeanor. She observed the meticulous arrangement of objects, the interplay of light and shadow, the quiet precision in every line and surface, and she recognized that attention, awareness, and adaptability were as essential here as action or words. Jackson moved to a side table, retrieved a small notebook, and opened it with careful precision. The pages filled with detailed notes and diagrams, each entry reflecting foresight, planning, and a life governed by intention. Emily's attention lingered on the notebook, absorbing the subtle cues of order and structure, sensing that understanding this environment required more than passive observation. It required insight and presence. He returned to his position by the window, eyes meeting hers with quiet intensity, and Emily felt the weight of unspoken expectation, a silent test of her composure and attentiveness. The soft light, the muted sounds, and the calm rhythm of the room enveloped them, creating a space where every gesture, glance, and breath carried significance. Emily set the glass down carefully, her fingers brushing the smooth surface, and straightened, aware that the night had already shifted her world, that she had crossed a threshold into a space where awareness, observation, and resilience were as vital as understanding, and that the coming hours would demand her full engagement, insight, and adaptability within the carefully maintained balance of this controlled yet intricate world. The first light of dawn crept through the tall windows, brushing the polished floors with pale gold, and Emily felt the quiet shift of the night giving way to the possibilities of the day. She sat upright, hands resting on her knees, mind alert, fully aware that the events of the previous hours had changed the rhythm of her life irreversibly. Jackson Drake moved across the room with a deliberate grace, each footstep measured, each gesture intentional. Yet there was a subtle softness in the way he surveyed the space and her presence within it. The storm outside had passed, leaving the city slick and glistening, reflections of streetlights winking through the glass. But inside, the calm control of the compound remained absolute. Emily observed the intricate details around her, the carefully arranged furnishings, the subtle interplay of shadows and light, the quiet hum of the heating system blending with the distant, muted city sounds, and she understood that every element was part of a larger design. A framework within which decisions carried weight and observation was a measure of character. Jackson returned to the chair across from her, his blue eyes steady, calculating, yet not without an acknowledgement of the composure and resilience she had demonstrated. Tonight, tested more than courage, he said, his tone calm, yet imbued with gravity. It tested awareness and adaptability, qualities you possess in abundance. Emily felt a momentary warmth, a flicker of validation, yet she also felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the recognition that entering this world came with expectations that extended beyond immediate survival. She spoke softly, describing the challenges she had faced, the structured chaos of her routines, the perseverance that had kept her moving forward, and the small victories that had defined her days. Jackson listened intently, his expression unreadable but his focus unwavering, as if every word, every subtle movement, was a data point in understanding the person who had crossed the threshold into his domain. The room seemed suspended in time, the amber light softening edges, the subtle scent of cedar and polished wood mingling with the faint trace of coffee lingering in the air. Emily felt the steady beat of the room's rhythm, the quiet acknowledgement that her choices mattered, that her presence was significant in this controlled environment. Jackson finally leaned forward slightly, his gaze holding hers with quiet intensity. "You will need to trust your instincts and observe carefully," he said, each word deliberate, carrying an authority tempered by subtle encouragement. Emily nodded, understanding that her engagement in this space required both vigilance and insight, that the night had provided lessons in awareness, composure, and understanding the unspoken language of power. She set her hands on her lap, feeling a calm determination settle over her, the awareness that the unfolding hours would require both courage and attention, and that the journey ahead, though uncertain, held the promise of clarity through careful observation. As the sun climbed higher, casting a gentle glow across the room, Emily understood that her presence here was now entwined with the rhythm and expectations of this world, and that her path, guided by instinct, awareness, and measured choices, would define the delicate balance between adaptation and understanding within the precise and controlled environment Jackson had established.